Hello. Hi. Welcome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Christian Ramirez. I'm the Kahn Assistant Curator of Contemporary and Community Art Initiatives at Phoenix Art Museum. We're so happy to have you all here tonight. We will be in for a wonderful treat of a great artist talk with Eamon Ore-Giron, part of the Lenhardt Lecture Series, which is one of my favorite parts of my job, is getting to work on this project. So thank you so much, David, for funding such an amazing program. So before we get started, I'd just like to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones and to feel free to take photos, but please no flash photography. And I'm going to introduce Jeremy Mikulazek, the Sybil Harrington Director at Phoenix Art Museum.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Christian. And it's great to see everybody here this evening. Maybe next time we'll be passing out warm blankets. We know it's a little chilly in here, so that'll be one of our new experiences here at Phoenix Art Museum. But we truly welcome everybody, and so grateful to have you here this evening for the Lenhardt Lecture, the Fall Lenhardt Lecture, which I will concur with Christian, one of our great programs here at Phoenix Art Museum, and truly a mainstay of our education and engagement program. And on behalf of the entire museum, of course, we want to recognize our deepest thanks and gratitude to Don and David Lenhardt, who in 2017 established the Lenhardt Lecture as part of a larger initiative here at Phoenix Art Museum to enhance the contemporary art program. To date, we've had many lectures and acclaimed artists here with us on this particular stage, including Jim Hodges, Shara Hughes, Teresita Fernandez, Amalia Mesa Baines, Ark Monoro Niles, Derek Forjoy, Rashid Johnson, Otis Kwame Kikweko, Larry Ose-Mensah, Leonardo Drew, and Lily Stockman, and of course tonight, Eamon Ore-Giron. This is an incredible program here at the museum, and again, expanding the dialogue. Again, what is contemporary art? You know, the interests of contemporary artists working today. And of course, we are really fortunate to have many of these artists in our collection here and on view right now in the museum. I'm also so glad to see so many friendly faces in the audience. We're so grateful for those who traveled near and far to join us this evening. And I want to give a special welcome to our Circles of Support members and donors, our museum members, and our board members here this evening. So we want to thank you for the support, and let's give them a round of applause. One of the great aspects of this lecture series, and to have such incredible staff here at the museum, including our curatorial team and this particular program led by Christian, is the engagement that these artists have in the community. Every single lecture, we provide some aspect to really bring these artists in and to have them in front of artists in this community. And I want to also give a special recognition to those artists and students who are here with us this evening, as well as participating in a program last night where they had held a salon here in Phoenix. And again, just to talk about this engagement, to talk about the greater art world, and to really bring some of the best aspects. We always think here at the museum that artists in the museums are great ambassadors, and it's always great to expose new artists to new other artists from other regions. And so again, thank you to those artists and students who are here with us, and we look forward to engaging you even further. For those of you who don't know the history of this particular program, but in this particular case with Eamon, he is our first Lenhardt Lecture speaker that is actually from our home state here in Arizona. So. Born in Tucson and now based in Los Angeles, his practice embodies transcultural, cross-disciplinary approach to seeing and making with paintings that reference indigenous and craft traditions, as well as 20th century avant-gardes. By drawing on vocabularies of architecture, textiles, maps, hieroglyphics, and astral charts, Eamon arrives at a visual language that is both uniquely his own, yet resonant across cultural contexts. In addition to painting, Eamon works in video and music to explore the interrelationship of sound, color, rhythm, and pattern, and manifest a history of transnational exchange. Overall, his practice seeks to destabilize linear Western art historical inheritances by suggesting a shared heritage of forms and ideas. Throughout his career, Eamon has exhibited nationally and internationally, both as a solo practitioner as well as part of collaborative endeavors. He has also been selected to realize major public commissions in New York and Los Angeles. And this evening, we are very excited for him to share a preview of his newest private site-specific commission, created exclusively for Phoenix Art Museum in the Greenbaum Lobby, which many of you entered through this evening. This incredible work will debut to the public in March of 2025, and we are deeply grateful to Eamon for not only joining us this evening for the Lenhardt Lecture, but also for sharing in the privilege of actually hosting this magnificent piece, as every single visitor who walks into the museum gets to experience this first upon entering to this great space. So please, let's give a warm welcome, a very warm welcome to Eamon Ore-Giron this evening. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello. I want to thank the Phoenix Art Museum. I want to thank Olga, Jeremy, and David for providing this opportunity. So I kind of thought I'd organize the night I thought I'd start with home, like the idea of home. And in home, as an artist, I think it can mean a lot of different things. And I think, so I thought I'd kind of traverse some of my artistic DNA, my literal DNA, through my connection to Arizona, but then also my artistic DNA in terms of some of the influences that I've had. And then from there, kind of take you through earlier parts of my work, moving into what is probably what I'm best known for, is kind of the more abstract work, and then move into what I'll be presenting for the entrance here. In that process, thinking about home, I came across, let me see real quick, this image that I just took a kind of random photo, and it's out of you can see the kind of like photo album background. And that's me as a baby, and that's my mom, that's my sister, and that's my brother. And, it's kind of interesting, like this lecture in particular, I don't know, it's like thinking about these things that are like, sometimes, in other locations, you can be like one step removed, from like kind of, you just go deep into like whatever idea that you're thinking of. And like this thinking about home, this prompted a lot of those type of ideas of like memories, and memories of a specific environment, which is like Phoenix. For me, it was Tucson, but the desert, the Sonoran Desert. And so I thought I would talk about, like that type of background. And to me, I really like it. It's a common thread throughout my work is influences that are rooted in the desert, are rooted in the horizon, are rooted in, like you saw this sunset today, this kind of like almost like computer generated vision. And at the same time, deeply rooted in like tactileness and dirt and greenery and like a wet desert, which is kind of somewhat paradoxical. So anyways, like I thought about some of the deeper connections to like my mother. She worked at a little town called Tapawa, which is like on the road if you go to Baba Kivri, which is a mountain south of here. She taught at a little tiny school there, and I remember as a kid going there, and we used to climb up to Itoi's cave in Baba Kivri, and this was like a different time in Arizona. It was like a time where there wasn't this militarization. Like you didn't have to cross border patrol checkpoints on your way. It was a very open space, and her family was. Some of them were ranchers out near Agua Prieta and like Busy and Huachuca. And then also miners in like Globe, Arizona and Bisbee in that area. And so, it's just kind of like, I get a little bit like emotional thinking about it. And so I think, but it's important because it kind of like, to me, it's like a really good like entryway into where I develop my visual language, and how many cultures played a part in that. And in terms of Arizona, I think like experiences, she was good friends with Danny Lopez in Cells, and he was like a cultural guardian basically for the Tohono people. And I think as like a funny Irish American girl from Tucson, like being friends and having access to these people, to me that's the Arizona that I love, and that's the Arizona that I think about, is like these interesting kind of intersections, you know, and going to Pascua and seeing the chapayecas and the dancers and things like that. So that's that photo. And moving on out of that, you know, in my art education, I went to San Francisco. And this is a work by Carlos Villa. And he was a Filipino-American artist. He was my teacher there. He taught there, gosh, I think since the early 80s, all the way to like 2010 maybe. And working with Carlos, he really gave me a lot of permission. He gave me a lot of permission and a lot of confidence in thinking about an expanded view of art, you know, because at that time, a lot of what was being taught was New York school, European abstraction, European abstract expressionism. And like, I love New York, no diss, but like, it was important for me to come across somebody like that at such a formative time, because it was somebody that like pivoted my view, pivoted my angle of thinking. And in that pivot, I saw what he had done as an artist, like through his work and in his practice, which is this like beautiful cape, which was like, for him, he was living in a time like in the 60s, 70s, and he went to New York as well, where, you know, it was very hard for a Filipino artist to look back at his own culture and be like, I'm gonna use these forms. I'm gonna think about these forms, and I'm gonna like express them and try to get shows in galleries, you know, and not be kind of marginalized as like some neo-tribal artist. You know, to me that was important, that he like pivoted into that and he pushed it because it's his language, you know. And so I don't know if Julio's here. Julio's another apprentice of Carlos's, but Carlos had a huge impact on me, and he's just now getting a lot of notoriety for the work that he's done. And I think he kind of was like a harbinger of like a lot of conversations that were about to happen in the US. And then this is another artist that I worked with in the 90s. Is this microphone, am I holding this correctly? Okay, good. This is Josue Sanchez. And yeah, it's wild. Like, I met him in the 90s, in 96. And I'm about to open a show of his at Art Basel Miami. He's in his 80s. I think he just turned 80. And it's kind of like wild that, like, you know, like dreams can come true that way, where you can take these visions and bring them to a place like Miami, bring them into these worlds. And so Josue Sanchez, I worked with in the 90s. He's from the town that my father's from, which is Huancayo, Peru, Ayacucho, that area, which is up in the mountains of Peru. And when I met him, you know, I think one of the main things that really kind of made me think about kind of what Carlos had kind of pivoted me towards was my artistic history. You know, who are the people that I want to learn from? What is that language? And so to meet Josue was eye-opening, to say the least. And it reaffirmed that type of approach towards like almost like your own kind of self-invented scholarship. And so not only is my work like, I think like explicitly referencing Josue through the use of color and the form and some of the approaches, but also Carlos's work implicitly, like in his ideas towards like, it's okay to look into your culture, you know. So this is a work called Cherry Truck, 2003. So this is work coming out of having worked and lived with Josue. And you can see the vibrancy, that electricity in the color. And so that's definitely like something that Josue, you know, kind of injected into my work. And a lot of that had to do with he was limited in his palette because there's no art store where he lives. You know, he had to just go to the hardware store. And so I did the same thing when I came back to Arizona. I was like, oh, I'm gonna like start looking around my world and look at kind of maybe in some ways like interrogate the world around me, but like look at these images of like what we tell ourselves about like who we are. And so I would go to steakhouses and like places like in Tucson, there's a place called Tombstone Steakhouse. And I went to another one, like, I think it was like up near Flagstaff. And they had like mountain lions like launching over the buffet. And they had like all kinds of like different, interesting, weird Western little moments. And so I thought I would depict that, you know. And when I started painting, I went to Home Depot and got house paint, just like Josue had. And so I have a whole series around this time period that's like Arizona putt-putt golf, like mini golf. And I was trying to kind of like carve out this space that was like a dream space that was like not quite Arizona and not quite Peru and not quite California and not like this kind of like this imaginary space, because the more that I kind of like looked at these steakhouses and I looked at the images of the West and stuff, the more that I realized all of it was just like everything is just imaginary on some level. The imagined West, you know. And so one thing, though, that carries across in a lot of this work, like I think of the pink ground that it's on, I almost think of it as like pink skin. And the horizon line is something that's carried across, like through almost all the work that you'll see tonight, even in the abstractions. This is, a year later, Praise for the Morning. And this is part of that, a reimagining, you know, kind of almost like a dream state of the West. Kind of imagining myself almost like a ghost from the Old West.
All right, cool.
Listening to like a tape player. And so, you know, living in these two worlds, going to Peru, being connected to this place that's very different than Arizona, but also very similar in some ways. I started to make work that was kind of like, you know, you would buy paint and it would say flesh tone. And that flesh tone was like white all the time. And so these were painted with flesh tone, and it's my aunt and my cousin making what's really similar to tamales, but in Peru they call them humitas. They're like wrapped in corn. And I kind of thought, it'd be interesting to kind of create this like diptych of them as like the white women, and then as like the brown women. And I also like this idea of like anthropomorphizing the landscape. And so my aunt is kind of wearing like a cholla cactus sweater, and her head is kind of turning into a mountain, and the clouds are kind of wisping around them. It's kind of like, I like this idea of kind of like, in our memories, like families become like features of the landscape, And so I'm also very interested in music, and I should have mentioned that in the beginning. I practice many different art forms, video. I am kind of like an archivist in terms of music, and a DJ and producer, and recently did a compilation of music from Mexico. It's actually from a DJ scene in Mexico, but they play a lot of Peruvian and Colombian music slowed down, like they play records slower, so it has a different kind of rhythm to it. And we put out a compilation on a label in Germany, and I bring it up because like I think another big part of my DNA is like thinking about like the ways in which culture travels, and the ways in which like, and for me music is like there's like a direct way of seeing how it travels, and having lived in Mexico City, I have family as well in Hermosillo, Sonora, like understanding how like other parts of Latin America influence Mexico as well, and the ways in which Mexico then reflects that back onto Latin America as well, other parts of Latin America. And so, this photo was taken, 2001. It's a chonguinada, and the music is really celebratory, lots of trumpets and clarinets and saxophones. And what's fascinating about this dance is it touches on kind of like the colonial structure of like Peru. Like each dancer kind of plays off of certain characters within the colonial structure of the Andes. And these women are considered like the indigenous women. And the men who wear these kind of masks that you see that have like kind of like a pink face and a little mustache, they kind of represent the viceroyal, the government, the viceroyalty. And then you have these other characters that are kind of more mysterious. They kind of play off of different ideas about Andean animism and shamanism. And so I got really fascinated with these dances. And so based on that photo, I created this painting. And it's still kind of in that idea of like the dream. Like this is Sueño Huamanguino. Huamanga is the place in which the dance takes place. But for me, it was like I wanted to kind of make it my own and kind of twist it and play around with it. And in some ways, I mean, I guess I've never really thought about it this way, but it is kind of related to surrealism on some level. By creating almost like a disorientation within the dance, something that's very folkloric, that's like, follows a certain tradition, but being able to kind of break that and twist it a little bit. This is the same dance. It's being performed by different people in Huancayo. And this is a photo that I took, in 98 when I was working with Josue Sanchez. And then this is the work created based on that, on those photos. So I one thing that fascinates me about this, and at that time too, was like the idea of like the mask, you know, taking off the mask, putting it on, the long hair, what does that represent? How does that like get negated by the face and by the mask? And then I place them in this kind of, I think in some ways like accentuate that idea of that landscape that I was trying to allude to earlier, where it wasn't quite Arizona, it wasn't quite California, it wasn't anywhere specific, by making it into a golf course. So you see like a little, because a golf course is a weird place, right? I mean, it's like kind of, you're in a fantasy when you're in it. And you're trying to get that ball in that hole. The harder you try, the worse you're going to do. So, you know, I had mentioned like being interested in music and kind of having that part of my practice. There's so much. If I was to do a lecture on all the things, we'd be here for many, many hours. So, you know, there's a bit of a step in this moment from that figurative work. And within that step is collaborative works that I did with many different groups, and usually rooted in music and performance. For me, it was kind of like, I think music and performance was like a really great way. It was almost like an antidote to painting, because sometimes painting is so monastic. You know, you're sitting there and you're really with yourself. And like performance and music was like a great way to connect with people and to like express things in a different way. And so, you know, it was never a full gap from painting, but that transition from the figurative work into the abstraction was definitely like notable. You know, there was a period where I just didn't, I played around with text-based work and kind of different applications of paint. But when I came back to paint, to kind of like a more, I don't know, cohesive language, that's when I started working in these abstractions. And the circles are based on records. So they were stenciled from 12-inch records and 45s, and then the smaller one is like a CD. And so it was like a way to kind of like take this thing that I had been doing in this other realm and then kind of start making impressions of that and seeing where that kind of the overlaps were. And I think in this work especially, again, like you'll see like that it's done on a raw linen. And so you'll see this connection kind of to the palettes of the desert, like how that is really deep in that DNA that I was talking about, you know, that sense of home. And at the time, like, I had been really interested in internationalist movements, and because what I had mentioned earlier, kind of this idea about like, you know, your self-scholarship, like making up your own kind of scholarship. In that process, you know, it kind of pushed me into different, it forced me to investigate different ideas around abstraction. And so in this work, what I was really inspired by and looking a lot at was like Brazilian modernist work and constructivist work in Russia, and the Distill, which is like an international avant-garde. And I was really interested in these ideas of like, you know, we think of abstraction always in the sense that it came from Europe. And we were talking about it today at lunch, like how, you know, Joseph Albers went to Mexico, and that was like kind of one of the biggest moments in his career when he formulated his language. And he would write letters from Mexico that was like, you know, I'm in the Mecca of abstraction. And that abstraction actually is rooted here. It has its own history here. And so to me, like the deeper I kind of went into those kind of ideas and that investigation, that's where this work really, I think, like really reflects that. I mean, a lot of it too is like part of, it's a kind of balance between this idea of like scholarship, but then also the pure joy of of painting. Like, so there's these two kind of sides to it that I'm always kind of playing with. And I think within these works too, there's a lot of improvisation and learning how to kind of utilize the picture plane. And the linen kind of acts almost as like a deeper space, even though it's just totally like physical. When you see it, it's like, it's like that soundproofing almost, like you can see the weave. And there's irregularities, and there's sometimes like little bits of grass get stuck in it when they're weaving it. And I like that idea of like the linen kind of being kind of like, it's not super like, I'm not like against painting on like a white surface, but like it was very liberating to paint on a surface that was just raw. Not like some store-bought bright white paint. It allowed the structure of the painting to kind of come alive. And so around this time, 2015, around that time, I was in Peru. I had experienced some very intense kind of life moments. And, I started to become obsessed with these gold objects and gold masks and nose rings and these really elaborate, beautiful pieces of work, from pre-Columbian work. And I thought about like, in terms of the materiality, that the gold being this kind of, at that time, like when these objects were made, they had a totally different value. They were not just like money, they had a spiritual value. They had a ritual value. And I also just love this idea of kind of like the gold functioning as like a screen that you look at things passing behind them, And I remember actually really clearly, like it was late at night and the full moon was full, and I was watching the moon pass through this like tin fence, and there was a hole in the fence, and watching the moon kind of, and it was making me think of these type of structures, these like physical things that have punctured holes in them. And these stones. And this is a nose ring, so your nose that clips into your nose. And what they were worn for was to obscure the mouth when the priest would speak. So it was the divine voice. You didn't see the mouth move. And I liked that idea, like this idea that like that's almost like painting in some ways. Like painting is like a divine voice on some level. It's some inner voice that's coming out. And so this is the work. It's hard to replicate in like a video screen, But what you see that kind of looks like yellow or like ochre color is actually like reflective iridescent, like gold paint. And so, looking back at this object, you can see the shapes as that negative space. And so even within like the colors, like the reds up there, by doing shifts in values, you can allude to this deeper space. and that the canvas becomes this place that like is almost talking about something unseen, something beyond. And there's other like little moments that come out, and it's really interesting to like have people write about the work, because I remember the show that I did at Cohan back in 2020. Somebody wrote about it as there's like echoes of the Virgin, because like the Andean Virgin is always depicted as like a triangle. She's like this, almost like emulating or evoking the mountains, like the sharp mountains. And I like that idea. And I thought of like the lower part functioning almost like a skirt, you know? And then the center almost could be like a flame or some sort of like core candle, you know? And then there's somewhat cosmological kind of things occurring with like, you know, bodies, celestial bodies passing each other, you know? This is another early work in this series, yeah, 6. And I titled The Infinite Regress because a friend and I, of mine and I had been talking about, like, he had brought it to my attention, this idea about infinite regresses. And I still probably don't have it right, because I'm not like big on philosophy, but is this idea of a never-ending cycle of questioning, and how like when there are 3 different kind of points being kind of argued, that like when it can become a cascading moment when one truth is like uncovered, and that it then feeds into a feedback loop of like reasoning. I probably butchered that, but I liked this idea of like kind of the cyclical nature of painting too, and like constantly trying to kind of play with these same forms and seeing how many different combinations and how kind of that can be very enlightening in itself, the process of that. And there's another definition for infinite regress, which is when you put 2 mirrors facing each other and you stand in between, and you get that echo, and that's infinite regress. So for me, it was kind of like talking or touching on like notions of like time. And having looked at that gold work and having like thought about that gold work, just how the past is not something that is gone. It's always with us, you know? And the act of painting even is just to engage in that conversation, like a historical conversation, whether you're conscious of it or not. This work is, I think it's in the SF MoMA collection. And the scale of these works started to expand. They started to get bigger. Because I kind of liked, as I expanded them, they started to really take on ideas about like landscape and ideas about like, you know, the sky and terrestrial elements of the composition and celestial elements of the composition. And you'll see on that right side where the linen almost just cuts that circle off as it like passes to that horizon. And so again, it's like the horizon is there. It was in the figurative work, and it's like still there. It's like this kind of ever-present kind of way of thinking about positionality, like where am I? this is probably close to accurately like the scale of it. So as I kept working in the infinite regress work, I got invited to do a residency at Stanford University. And I created an exhibition that included objects, artifacts from Panama and from Colombia, gold artifacts. And they also had the golden spike that Leland Stanford had, which was like the spike that was driven into the railroad connecting the Pacific and the Atlantic. And in that exhibition, gold took on this like really like literal role of like, this material that's really formed so much of our history, and especially being like Peruvian, like how much gold is a huge part of like our colonial history, and then even before. And in that exhibition, I was also really drawn to other works by Puryear, Martin Puryear. They had a Jackson Pollock that was painted in black, and it was from a period where he had been influenced by the Mexican muralists, Siqueiros. And so I kind of curated this other exhibition of black works, and I created these black works based on the infinite regress. And these works are called Black Medallion. And so it kind of put into question kind of the idea of like, we all know how gold, the value of gold is, but what if you remove that and make black the value? And to me, it was like kind of ideas. I kept thinking of De La Soul has like a lyric where they say black medallions, no gold. And like, to me, that was also like really interesting. Like, to me, I grew up with a lot of that like early hip hop stuff. And so for me hearing that, I was like, oh, I see. They're like reacting to the kind of bling era, and like just these ideas of like, taking out the gold, putting in the black, and what does that do to that body of work? And I like it because also the black, like it's so deep, and it's done with like a very matte paint, and so it doesn't reflect light, it absorbs it. And so it does give this sense of kind of that, again, that idea of like space and like how you're dealing with that as a painter with like confined in the picture plane. And, luckily I've had these opportunities to work at this scale where the work enters a monumental scale. And this is for an exhibition in Philadelphia, and it is based on the morning sun and the evening, the sunset, and kind of ideas about history and about this is actually, it's kind of complicated, but behind this painting is actually a painting from, I think, 1860. And it's, or may have been a little bit earlier, of Christ the Redeemer, and so it was interesting to install this work like over this work that was about kind of like European triumphalism, and like in this world where the U.S. was expanding in this era, in this city, Philadelphia, to go in there and kind of, to me, I wasn't trying to consciously relate to that object because I didn't want to, but like to occupy that space and introduce a different history introduce a different idea about like the lineage of our abstraction and our forms. And if you happen to be in New York in January 29th, I'm collaborating with the choreographer Justin Peck at Lincoln Center, and the backdrop of the dance will be one of these works at really large scale, and they're doing some really interesting work with like backlighting it, kind of animating it. And it's kind of, for me, it's like a dream come true, because as a painter, you know, and somebody who's super interested in music, I love this idea of like starting to really expand the idea of like how people interact with the painting. So I don't know how much time. Oh, we got like another 10. I don't know if who's gonna be like, hey, all right. But 5? Oh, wow. Okay, I gotta run. This is a series that I started when I was living in Guadalajara in 2015. I was painting in the studio of Jose Clemente Orozco, one of the great Mexican muralists. And I have always been fascinated with Mexican deities and pre-Columbian history, and because I think in Mexico, especially because like when I was probably around like 20, 21, I lived in Mexico City for a year, and I just remember like the echoes of that past are everywhere, like in the architecture, even in the most modern buildings. Like they are totally, you could trace that line to the forms that you see in pre-Columbian work. And I was reading a book that was called The Stone and the Thread by Cesar Paternoster, and he's an Argentinian artist, and he's talking about the roots of Andean abstraction. And in the opening of the book, he talks about this the deity Coatlicue, who was like the goddess of destruction and fertility, and in the Aztec world. And he talks about the history of that statue, and how when the Spanish first came, they were terrified by it, and so they hid it. They which is amazing that it survived, that it just didn't get totally destroyed. But they wrapped it in cloth and they put it in a convent, and so it became kind of like a monster. And then in the modern era, like when in the 60s, 50s, mid-century era, it was brought back out from that monastery, and it became kind of like the crown jewel in the collection at the Museum of Anthropology. And I loved this idea of like, I think Octavio Paz wrote about it, saying like from monster to masterpiece. And like, I love that idea, like that this thing could be like so reviled and terrifying, and then it's also then becomes like the most proud thing that you have, you know, and the ways in which these symbols evolve according to people's like, you know, opinions and their perspectives. And so I started this work called the Talking Shit series. And for me, it was looking at these objects that I love so much and forming a relationship with them, you know, and these forms, and thinking about like, thinking about the deities as like a vessel for communication, and also to kind of keep on that kind of idea about the past constantly living with us and evolving, that it's not just like frozen in amber. And so the Talking Shit series is very complicated, and I could give a whole lecture about like all the different facets of it. But in terms of the paintings, this is Talking Shit with Quetzalcoatl, and it's the plumed serpent. And so you see on the right there that it kind of alludes to like the plumage. And the bottom here is the head. And I started to work with different artisans in Mexico to create different versions of it in like woven work, and then also in ceramic. And it started to become kind of like, this is Coatlicue, this is the statue that I was talking about. I guess I should have switched that slide sooner. There's the two serpent heads. And then the hands. And Coatlicue is a direct translation to serpent, snake, a serpent skirt. So if you see that her skirt is woven serpents. And this was my interpretation of that. So it's talking shit with Coatlicue. And so there's an element of the series that involves inviting other artists from Latin America and people that have that kind of lineage to reflect on these type of ideas about history and time being able to be malleable, and doing performances. And I've created a number of performances and music pieces based on it as well. This is talking shit with Amaru, and Amaru is a deity from Peru. So I've started to expand the series into deities from Peru as well. And I also have been looking at a lot of objects in Peru don't have like a lot of information on the provenance, like in terms of like how they functioned or who made them, and I just kind of, the more I've dived into all of this, I love looking at the objects too and thinking of like, it's like a way for me to kind of have that object, you know? Like if this object is in some collection in Switzerland or something, it's like, it's mine now when I paint it. And like, I think also this idea of like reinterpretation stays along with like kind of the thematics that I had kind of started with, is like ideas about reinterpreting. And it's also like can kind of touch on where abstraction starts to kind of butt up against representational art. And in that pre-Columbian work, there was no distinction between those two worlds. It wasn't like, oh, I only do abstraction. Oh, I only do figurative work, so it was this synthesis. And so to me, that was like a really exciting kind of thing to go back to representational work and think about like the ways in which I can kind of my agency in that action, you know, and also seeing how a lot of the abstraction in the pre-Columbian work, you can see it in weavings, especially how figures and forms that were much more kind of fluid, they get boxed in because they have to be dealing with vertical and horizontal. It's like mathematical, and they start to become abstract. So you can trace certain deities through weavings and see how they get totally distorted and abstracted. And this is at the Hammer Museum. This is a piece called Angelitos Negros. So I'll wrap it up with I've somewhat recently been starting to work in public work, and like it kind of follows through on those interests of like kind of like a shared language, a shared civic language. And so I'll show a couple works that represent that, and then I will give you guys a preview of the piece that's going to be in the entranceway. So this is Angelitos Negros. You can see this wall here on the left is very much coming out of that infinite regress language. And then the piece to the right is kind of hearkening back to the earlier abstraction. And this is a mosaic tile, like small Venetian tile. And this is in Brooklyn. It's a subway station, and there's, I think, like maybe 40 like nichos like this on both sides. And then I'm currently working on a large metro project in Los Angeles at Wilshire and La Brea. So, you ready? Okay. This is a studio shot. And I don't know what's been revealed in terms of the title, but the title is Tomorrow's Monsoon. And like thinking about home and thinking about those things that I started the lecture with, like to me, the monsoon is something that like I will always miss when I don't live in Arizona. It's the thing that will always be like what there's just the smell of the air and the wind and being able to watch it from far away, And so the piece, it's very hopeful, even though things may not seem very hopeful right now. But I want to provide that, I want to provide that idea of like tomorrow there's a monsoon, that I get concerned when I don't see it raining, if it's a dry summer. And so the piece is, because it's such a stretched out section, it's so kind of almost like a scroll. I believe it's 33 feet wide by 6 feet tall. To me, it was just so like automatic to think about the horizon again, and to think about the ways in which you see weather and you see things in the desert. And when you zoom in, then you see the life in the desert. And so the kind of anthropomorphic element to the piece is, this is the sketch. So this is just like about this big, it's not very big, but it's what the bigger piece is based on. On the left is what kind of starts to evoke the head of a hawk, or multiple heads of hawks. You can kind of see different elements of that. The middle here, those little kind of teeth almost, are almost like hills off in the distance, like maybe south of Tucson, like Tumacacori or something like that. And then you've got your like wind, and then you've got your updrafts. And then you've got the bottom of the clouds when they catch that sunlight in the sunset. And then you get the head of the serpent, which is on this side. So you've got this like one animal that can really only exist on the ground, and one animal that can live up in the sky. Cool. So, yeah.
So we have time for like 2 or 3 questions. Does anyone have a question? No? Everything's answered? Okay, cool.
Eamon, I wonder if you could talk about just your process, like how you come up with the forms. This is a study. It seems like drawing is a part of your practice, and I'm just interested in how, you actually work to find the forms.
With this work, what I really enjoyed about it, it was very much more like improvisational than other works. Other works I kind of work within a kind of set formula almost, where I know where certain elements are going to live. And so, but I start with drawing and kind of like pulling out the form that way. And then allowing intersections to occur, because I know in those intersecting moments, that's where the relationship of color can really kind of be on full display, where it can kind of flex that muscle, where, like the blues, they can kind of allude to like a deeper space there. Like when you see it, the big piece, it's almost like you can climb inside of those. And they're like the rib cage of the snake. These kind of like dagger type of forms, but they're like the updrafts of the air. And so, yeah, it starts with pencil, really simple pencil. And I think that it reminds me too, is like I do remember when I first, in those early abstract works, like I do remember really being conscious of like the early figurative works, I was using a projector to base the work off of, like those photos that I showed you of the dancers and stuff. And it was really like liberating to just like make work with literally a pencil and whatever I found around me. And like, so that was like a big moment in my process. And so keeping it kind of rudimentary in that sense has like been really like liberating in terms of being a painter. I can do it anywhere. I don't rely on certain things, you know.
I was just wondering. Okay, I'm sorry. Sometimes artists, while you were working on this piece, and if you wanted to tell us how long this took you, but I was wondering, do you work a while on this, and then do you go to something else that you're working on at the same time? Or do you just do one piece to completion?
Yeah, multiple things are always happening. Yeah, it gets too hard sometimes, and that is like, in terms of like when I didn't have as much pressure as an artist, it was a lot easier to go with the flow on work. And as there's more projects and more pressure, I have to kind of keep a lot of things going. And so that like I pretty much draw a lot of work out, and then they kind of start to take shape, and I have assistants that fill in the work and stuff, and then the last like 10% or so is where I sit down, and that's where like all the work kind of bottlenecks into like me really sitting down, because I can add things in that moment. You know, if I feel like it needs some more depth somewhere, then I can add that, you know, and not spend so much time working on these like large color fills. Yeah. Yeah.
How did this project come together that we are going to get this mural here at Phoenix Art Museum?
The curator. The curator, the amazing curator, Olga Viso. Olga reached out to me and was curious if I would be interested in doing a work there. Originally, I thought of maybe potentially doing something in ceramic or mosaic. I like that idea of like the work like being embedded in the architecture. But I also really love like the freedom of making the painting and having the painting be a work of art, you know, and be the welcoming gesture. Yeah.
So how did you decide to do this in the Greenbaum?
In the what? Oh, in the lobby? Yeah. I didn't decide that. Yeah. The curator decided it. Yeah.
When you switched from the more realistic to the abstract, was that also the switch from the Home Depot paint to
more high end?
Well, is it oil or is it acrylic? That was the question.
It is flash and mineral paint. And yeah, I think like with the figurative work, I mean, there's so much to like expand on, but with that figurative work, that early work, it's almost like for me, it was like the end of a story that I had told.
Okay.
You know what I mean? And like the last chapter was done and I closed it. And I think like when I then moved into the next body of work, it didn't carry that responsibility to the material necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How big were those first infinite regress pieces that you showed, the vertical?
The originals are really small. Like I didn't have a studio at the time and I was painting them at the kitchen table. So they were like, you know, maybe 12 inches, 20 inches. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much.